Are you finding yourself in an endless loop of perfecting and perfecting and perfecting your podcast before you put it out in the world? I get it. We've all been there. This episode is going to help you get over that perfection and just do the thing. Get your show out into the world. Let people know you have it. Let's talk through some strategies as well as some things that I've personally done to help me overcome this perfectionism that tends to be in podcasting. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Successful Podcasting Unlocked. I'm your host, Alicia Galati. I'm the founder of Galati Media, a full-service podcast management agency where we help business owners launch and maintain lead-generating shows. Today's question is, how do I stop obsessing over every detail and finally launch my podcast? Well, I'm glad you asked because this is something that I have struggled with over and over and over again with every single podcast that I launch. I am in the middle of launching my fourth hosted podcast. So we've launched tons of podcasts as an agency, but me, myself, of my own, hosting, this is my fourth one. Now, my first podcast, that one, I kind of just did it really messy. And I loved it being able to do that, but it taught me a lot. And one thing that it taught me was that if you ask, people will say yes. And they're actually more likely to say yes if you ask. And the answer is already going to be no if you don't ask. I remember when I launched that first one, I was really nervous about having guests on, and I had these really big, audacious guests that I really wanted to have on my show. And I very nervously sent them DMs on Instagram. And I'd been following them for years, but I was like, let me try this. Let me see. This was back in 2018 when I launched my first one. And I reached out, and everyone that I reached out to said yes. Some people might say, oh, you didn't reach too high. But I really think that if you reach for your goals and you connect with people on a really personal level and you say, hey, I want to have you on my show. Here's what I want to talk about with you. I think that would be really valuable for my audience, and here's why. It shows that you know your audience. It shows that you know this person and their expertise and that you want to highlight them. And they're more likely to say yes. So fast forward to 2024, I am in the middle of launching my fourth podcast. I have interviewed hundreds of people on these shows. I've guested on at least 100 shows. I know how to podcast. I know how to do this. I know how to reach out to people. But for some reason, I'm reaching out to these really big name people I admire in this space, who I kind of have a fangirl moment of, oh my goodness, if they say yes, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm probably going to have a panic attack. This is crazy. And these people are saying yes. And it feels really weird because I'm like, oh, who are you to do this? Who are you to talk to this big person? But that's just the perfectionism coming in and trying to stop me from taking action. Another thing that tends to hold us back from taking action on our podcast is that feeling of imposter syndrome and fear of failure. But I want you to think about this. And I had a friend say this to me, and I thought it was such an impactful message. And that is, someone else is talking about this and they're doing it terribly and they're very loud about it, right? We all know that one person or 3 to 10 people in our industry who are very loud about this message, who are very loud about their opinions on this topic, and we don't agree with those opinions. We don't agree with what they have to say. And I think that it's so important that if they're loud, then we need to be loud too. We need to get our message out there. We need to be able to express ourselves and our opinions to the people who are really feeling frustrated by this other person's voice. And if we don't do that, we are doing our audience a disservice. And that's the cost of perfectionism. It costs us time, effort, thought leadership. It costs us all of these things when we don't get out of our own way, get out of our own heads, and just take action. I want to share another story. I remember when I was working in corporate and I worked in manufacturing and supply chain. So I worked almost predominantly with men. And I had a coworker say, "Oh my goodness, Alicia, you have such an annoying voice." And that really stuck with me for quite some time. But because when I was 18, I got really sick and I got bronchitis in a really bad way due to mold at the college I was at. And it changed my voice to the point where before I would sing in choir and I was a soprano. And then I went to sing in choir and I was a bass, like from soprano to singing with the guys. And so I already had a lot of insecurities about my voice. I already had a lot of feelings and internal monologue about this voice that I have. And then to have that reflected back from someone saying something, that was really hard for me. And it was really difficult for me to say, I'm going to launch a podcast. And I had to fight that for a bit, especially with that first podcast. I had to fight this feeling of inadequacy, of you have an annoying voice or someone's going to think your voice is annoying. And I had to get over that and say, no, it doesn't matter if my voice is annoying. It doesn't matter if this one person had this opinion. There are people out in the world who are going to hear my message, who are going to change their lives due to this message. And I get messages from people who, I had one woman, she reached out and she said, I started listening to your podcast in February. It's now June and I launched my podcast because I listened to you. And that is why I do this. That is why I get out of my own way and I do my podcast and I put myself out there in this way. And it's really vulnerable. It feels really scary, but I know that I can do hard things. I know that you can do hard things. And so I want to encourage you to step outside of your comfort zone, step outside of the internal monologue that you're having, the external dialogues that are impacting you and stopping you from taking action. Now, I hope this was a hoorah of an episode for you. If you are struggling with this perfectionism, I want you to take a moment and write down the cost. What is the cost of your perfectionism? How much time and effort have you already put into this podcast? Write that down. What is the disservice that you would be doing toward your audience and your potential listeners if you didn't put your voice and your podcast out into the world? And then I want you to look at that cost, okay? And then I want you to say, is this worth it? Right? And it might be for you, and that's okay. But is it worth this cost to not do the thing? And remember, there are always other ways that you can put yourself out there. A podcast might not be right for you. It might be that you need to do a limited series to start. Take baby steps. Take those smaller, more incremental steps towards your goal rather than having this big goal of, I have to have 250 podcast episodes in order to be a podcaster. No, you can have 25 episode limited series and that's okay too. All of that is just getting your voice out into the world and making the impact that you want to make. All right. I hope this was encouraging to you. I know it got me kind of pumped up. Like, I'm excited about this new podcast. I am excited about the impact that I'm going to be able to make with it. And I hope that you are feeling similar. Until next time, happy podcasting.